We'll begin, as we often do, with this introduction. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the world, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I'm still able to say the prayer." And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save the people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient." And it was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. And then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizhin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. "I am unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient." And it was sufficient. Today, we're going to be looking at a number of stories that embellish what has been called the greatest story ever told. Except from a Jewish perspective, the greatest story ever told is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. This miraculous meeting of two different realms, the divine and the human, and the gift of a Torah from God to flesh and blood. And all of the differences that we can think of apply between God and us, and nevertheless, there's this connection that we share a Torah. God trusted with us with the Torah that was her precious possession. So the story of giving the Torah in our Torah is told a number of times, and it is a story to be reckoned with in and of itself. But I want to look at some stories that came from that story and are in a little bit of a kind of a dialogue and a tension with that story. So I'm going to share my screen. And this is our set of texts for today. And I've called it The Voices of Torah, Shouts and Whispers. So the first text that we have is just a little tiny piece from Deuteronomy telling about the story of giving the Torah. And of course, we have to remember that Deuteronomy is already a second telling. It is the second telling of the Torah. So the first telling of the story is found in the book of Exodus, in a number of places in the book of Exodus. And then it's referred to in many places, but then Moses reviews and tells the story in his own words. And for today's session, usually I ask somebody else to read, but for today's session, I'm going to keep it simple and I'm going to do the reading. So the beginning text, Et hadvarim ha'ele diber Hashem el kol ka'alchem bahar, mitoch ha'esh, he'anan, v'ha'arafel, kol gadol ve'lo yasaf, v'yichtaveim al shnei luchot avanim, v'yitneim elai. So this is Moses speaking, and he says, "It is these things that the Eternal spoke to your entire assembly at the mountain from out of the fire, the murky cloud, a great voice never ending, and wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me." And then Moses took them down the mountain and tried giving it to us. That's another story, not for today. So the idea that God's overwhelming presence God's awe-inspiring and even terrifying presence was there upon the mountain, mysteriously, but also in such a powerful way. And God spoke out these words with a great voice, an endless voice, a voice that went on and on and on, reverberating throughout space. So that's the shouts, right? God's voice is this overpowering and overwhelming voice. We know how much the children of Israel were terrified. And in the end, of course, Moses is pushed up the mountain at the demand of the people, and they say, you go, we can't take it anymore. What I want to do is look at a number of stories. We'll see 4 stories. And these stories are not about a great voice, but about a whisper, about the role of whispering in giving over the Torah. So the first story is quoted actually in a law book, the great law book of Rambam, of Maimonides, the Mishneh Torah. He takes that name actually from the book of Deuteronomy. His name was Moses, just like Moses of Deuteronomy. And we have a folk saying from one Moses to the first Moses to the other Moses, Moses Maimonides, there was no one like Moses. So his repetition of the entire Torah is the most amazing and comprehensive statement of Jewish law in our tradition. The famous code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, is much, much smaller and much more limited, but it's much more current. His magnum opus was produced at the end of the 12th century. And this is from Hilchot Kriyat Shema, the laws of Kriyat Shema. So he tells us all kinds of laws and details. And in regard to this law that he's going to tell us, he tells us a story as well. One who recites the Shema, and of course he tells you have to recite the Shema twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. One who recites the Shema, upon completing the first verse, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord, the Eternal, is our Almighty God. The Eternal is one. So after saying that verse, after completing that verse, says in a whisper, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. The name of the glory of God's majesty abounds in blessing forever and ever. Then one returns to reciting in the usual way, V'ahavta, that first paragraph, and you shall love the Eternal, your Almighty God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and all of that and continuing after that should be done in the usual way, right? Chanting it, reciting it by pronouncing every word out loud. So to its conclusion. So we see that the tradition has mandated an alternation between audible recitation and a whisper, quiet, inaudible recitation. Why is that? Rambam. And why do we recite in this manner? A tradition has been given to us that at the time Jacob, our patriarch, gathered his sons in Egypt at the hour of his death, he charged them and pressed upon them urgently concerning the unification of God's name and the divine path walked by Abraham and Isaac, his father. So this is a deathbed scene. It's not recorded in the Torah, but it's a tradition that Jacob, as he is dying, the Torah does tell us that he gathered all his 12 sons together. They're all standing there at his bed, and they were all present when he passed away. And the tradition fills in that besides what's recorded in the Torah itself, there was this moment where Jacob is telling them, I won't be here much longer. This is a path that I learned from my father, who learned from his father, Isaac from Abraham. I'm the third in line, and now you are the ones to follow me. And the path that we must continue to maintain is the dedication to the one and only God of the entire universe. And he asked them and said to them, my sons, is there perchance any disqualification among you? Anyone who does not stand along with me in unifying God's name? So he says, look, this is a moment of truth. Tell me, is there anybody here who doesn't subscribe to this sense of commitment and dedication and faithfulness? They all responded and said, hear, O Israel, the Eternal is our Almighty God. The Eternal is one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So according to this story, the first time that the Shema was recited was not as we have it in our Torah, but actually it was said by Israel, that's Jacob, by Israel's sons to him personally, not to the people of Israel, like Moses is speaking. When we recite the Shema Yisrael, we say, hear, O Israel, we're talking about all of the Jewish people. No, it was an intimate family circle, and Israel, the patriarch, the father of these 12 children, who are grown up by now, the father of these 12 sons, he hears them say, listen, Israel. Israel, of course, is his name as a patriarch. Jacob was the name that he was born with, but Israel is the name God gave him to be the leader of a tradition and a nation. Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel. Yes, the future is assured. We all accept God as one. That is to say, says Maimonides, hear from us, Israel, our Father. The Eternal is our Almighty God. The Eternal is one. The elder opened and said, blessed is the name of God's majestic glory forever and ever. He said these words, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. He responded, thank God. Therefore, all Israel have accustomed themselves to say, after the verse, Hear, O Israel, the praise that the elder Israel said. So we are, according to this, imagining this encounter, this last minute farewell between a father and his children, and the father pledging to, the children pledging to their father their faithfulness. They got it, everything that he taught them, they've taken to heart. And listen, Dad, we're moving forward, and we are faithful to everything you taught us. Thank you. And then we recite the words that the father said. Thank God. Wow, how beautiful, how wonderful, and how grateful I am, says Jacob, to God that this worked out, because you can never take it for granted. So this story is Maimonides' rationale. He gives this as the rationale for our custom. But if you look at the story itself, it doesn't quite answer the question, right? Does anybody follow what I'm saying? Does this story answer why we whisper the words Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed? It doesn't quite answer that question. It tells us why we add those words, but it doesn't tell us why we whisper those words. So this story is found in the Babylonian Talmud, in Psachim, and here is the conclusion of the discussion there. The rabbi said, how shall we act? Shall we, I'm going to not give away too much here, shall we say these words, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed? But Moses didn't say it. Moses does not include those words when he records the Shema Yisrael in the Torah, in Deuteronomy. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto is not in there. So he left them out. But still, continue the rabbis, Jacob said it. He did say it. So Jacob said it. So what should we do? Jacob said it, so we should say it. But on the other hand, Moses censored it out. He omitted those words from the Torah. They instituted that we should say it in a whisper. So the answer is we compromise. We say it to continue the idea of Jacob saying it, but we can't say it out loud because after all, it's not really in the Torah itself, is it? So this is the compromise, that we say it as a whisper. So now we look at one more source relating to that story. And this is from Maimonides, of course, is from Spain, and then he ran away and he had to go to North Africa, and then he was in Israel, then he was in Egypt. And this is Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, and he is one of the great sages and teachers and mystics from North Europe, from Ashkenaz. And he lived about a generation after Maimonides, into the 1200s. And he wrote a commentary, one of the first commentaries on the prayer book. So when he discusses the Shema, he says, among many other things, Jacob said, blessed be the name of God, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto, in a whisper. So it doesn't say it in the story we have in the Talmud, doesn't say it in Maimonides' story, but Rabbi Elazar Rokeach imagines he was a dying man. These are almost his last words. He said them in a whisper. So everyone should be cautious and say it without being heard, just as Jacob said it in a whisper, and Moses did not write it in the Torah. So what Rabbi Elazar Rokeach adds here, of course, is to the original story. The idea that we do this in a whisper is not some kind of legal compromise, according to what the Talmud says. Well, we should include it, we shouldn't include it, okay, we'll divide it in half. But rather, according to Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, saying these words in a whisper is actually part of the reenacting of that story. We're actually entering back into the story, and when we say those words in a whisper, we are repeating Jacob's experience. We're saying it in a whisper because Jacob said it in a whisper. And of course, he acknowledges, of course, it's not in the Torah, is it? So we're going to come back to this idea of the whisper and it not being in the Torah as we continue. Whispering story number 2. This is from a Midrashic collection, Midrash Devarim Rabbah, which is not the same thing as Midrash Rabbah that we have with the rest of the collection. This is a special Midrash that was discovered later, and the great scholar Rabbi Shaul Lieberman published an edition of this Midrash. Why does Israel say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto in a whisper? Same problem. So we see that this is a long standing tradition going back to rabbinic times. It's in the Talmud, in Middle Ages. And this is, of course, a midrash from rabbinic times. So why this ancient custom of changing from out loud to a whisper? It is because when Moses ascended to heaven, he stole it from the angels and taught it to Israel. You have a little bit of like a Jewish version of Prometheus, right? Of stealing the fire from the gods. Here, according to this story, the story is when Moses went up to heaven, he heard all of the angels. When one angel would say praises to God's name, then the other angels would say, yes, may God's great name, Baruch Shem, the name of God, be praised and blessed and abound in blessing forever and ever and ever. We have that repetition of that idea on Yom Kippur. When the high priest would do the prayers for atonement, we have a reenactment of the ritual of Yom Kippur. And there's this ritual where we fall flat on the ground, we bow, before God. And that's because we bow right when the high priest would pronounce the name of God the way we no longer know how to pronounce it, right? The unpronounceable name of God, the high priest had the secret of how to do that. And when people heard that awesome name, right? So when they heard that explicit name coming straight out of the high priest's mouth, they would they would fall down and prostrate themselves on the ground. Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Blessed be God's name, or God's name abounds in blessing forever and ever and ever. So how do we know to do that? The answer is Moses heard the angels doing it when the God was praised above in heaven, and Moses stole it and then taught it to Israel. Said Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, to what is this compared? Let me give you, he says, a parable to make this understood. To the son of the daughter of a king who had a young maiden daughter. Okay, so imagine the son of a princess. Does that remind us of anyone? Moses, of course, was the adopted son of the princess of Egypt, right? The son of the daughter of a king. She would see some beautiful clothes and would say to him, take these clothes for me, right? They would go on shopping sprees together. And she would say, here, look, I really love this dress, this crown, this whatever. And here, take this for me. Once he entered the palace of the king and saw a precious jewel of the great mistress. Not the princess, but the great mistress, right? He saw a jewel that belonged to the queen mother. He stole it and came and gave it to the king's daughter. He thought he was being such a loving son, so devoted to the princess who took care of him. And he said, look what I have for you. I have this wonderful, gorgeous jewel. He began to command and say to her, all the clothes that I took for you, you may wear in public, but this adornment is stolen. Only wear it inside within closed doors. So he says, but it's only a secret between you and me, because I actually took this without anybody's permission. So when you wear it, you're going to wear it only for me. Thus did Moses say to Israel, all the commandments that I gave you are whatever I have received from the Torah. But this mention of the name is from what I heard from the ministering angels, by which they praise the Holy Blessed One. And I snatched it from them. Therefore, make sure you say it only in a whisper. Of course, now the princess is us. We are the daughters of the king, the people of Israel. And Moses says to us, this is such a special treat, but shh, don't tell anybody you have it. It's so precious, it's so beautiful. But, I was a little naughty about taking it from its proper place. And then the Midrash continues, blessed is the name, Baruch Shem Kivod. Why do we say it on Yom Kippur openly? How come on Yom Kippur we actually say it out loud? Because they, meaning the children of Israel, they are like the angels, wearing white, not eating or drinking, and they are without sin or transgression. For the Holy Blessed One forgives them all their sins. So on Yom Kippur, we're not stealing it from the angels, we are the angels. So therefore we have every right to say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto out loud. But what does this tell us about the rest of the time? The rest of the time, we can't say it out loud. Why not? Anybody want to make a suggestion? What exactly is this trying to make us aware of? What should we be taking to heart according to this story?
That it doesn't fully belong to us and that our status changes.
Yeah, it's not all ours. The first story with Jacob, it's a mortal, literally a dying human being who says these words, and he maybe said it in a whisper because he was losing his strength was ebbing, or we say it in a whisper, as we noted, because in the end it wasn't included in the Torah itself. But according to this story, we say it in a whisper because we understand in a certain sense that it's a real chutzpah to say these words. These words of praying God, who are we to actually go over and say to God, hey, God, you're great. You're really amazing. Yashakoach, God, you did this really, you've done pretty well in this world. You created a magnificent world. Who is this little nothing that thinks that they can come over to God and pat God on the back? So at this moment, there's a sense of humility, but also chutzpah, because no matter how much we understand that we're not the angels, by golly, we're going to say this anyway. We're just going to share it with each other in a sense of intimate transgression. Right? We're all going to say it as a secret. It's a secret between us. Let's go to the third story of our collection of whispering stories. So this comes from citations of Midrash from one of the great chassidic teachers who died at the beginning of the 20th century. He's called Rab Tzadok, or Rab Tzadok HaKohen. He was in the city of Lublin, and he wrote a number of important books of chassidic teaching. And Pri Tzaddik is his book of Divrei Torah that he gave Shabbat afternoon every week to his congregation. So this comes from a Dvar Torah that he gave, and this is Dvar Torah number 7 for the Parsha of Kitisa. So they say, this comes from Midrash Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehud Sadak asked Rabbi Shimon bar Nachman, said, since I've heard that you are a master of Agadah, right? You are a master of legends and spiritual stories or moral parables that teach us lessons. So you know all of this kind of stuff. I'm not asking you for a halacha. I'm not asking you for a legal ruling. But as a master of Agadah, let me ask you this question. From whence was the first light created? Right? One of these like really tantalizing questions. So at the beginning, where did the beginning come from? Where did that first light come from? So he said, it is taught that the Blessed Holy One was enwrapped in the light like a cloak, and God's glory shone forth from one end of the world to the other. So we allude to this story when traditionally we wrap ourselves in our talit when we begin praying. Ote or kasalma. Now, when Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman answered that this first light came from God enwrapping himself, enfolding himself in a garment, he said this in a whisper. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehud Sadak turned to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, and he said, wait a second, but this is an explicit verse, wrapped in light like a cloak. God was Ote or Kasalma, Psalms 104. We said that psalm traditionally today, it's Rosh Chodesh. So why do you say it to me in a whisper? What's the point? There it is. It's right there, an explicit verse in Psalms. I'm astounded. So his companion sage said to him, just as I heard it in a whisper, so have I said it to you in a whisper. That's the end of the Midrashic story. So does anybody want to speculate or suggest an explanation? What does this mean? What is, I heard it in a whisper, and therefore I'm going to say it to you in a whisper. What's that all about? Anybody? Carol?
I think it becomes part of tradition. And once something starts and you're saying it in a whisper, and it becomes the norm to say it in a whisper, it's tradition.
Okay.
And what I was thinking when we were doing the previous story or the first story, that when we said it in a whisper, I automatically thought of Yom Kippur when we say it out loud, and then you explained why. But when when the priest is saying it, but when we do the Shema, it's the one time all year long that everybody says it out loud at that particular point where they've said it whispering. But I think it's tradition, and we are a community of tradition.
So tradition not only gives us words and texts, but it also gives us performance instructions. Here's the way that we do this. We did it before like this. We do it now. But that, in a certain sense, begs the question. So what was the point of that tradition? Why was Rabbi Shmuel saying, I heard it in a whisper, so I'm giving it in a whisper? So why did he hear it in a whisper? Why did the first person do it in a whisper? So here we have Rab Tzadok beginning now at the, after I skipped a little space. At first glance, this answer is not understandable. Indeed, since this is an explicit verse, why did he hear it said in a whisper? Why is anybody saying in a whisper? It's a verse. But the matter is, as we have explained, regarding the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, Mishnah 24, Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the small, or Shmuel the younger, said, do not rejoice at the downfall of your enemy. So this is a quote that this sage, Shmuel HaKatan, used to say this piece of wisdom. So what did he say actually? So Reb Tzadok says, this is an explicit verse in Proverbs. What are you giving him credit? It's like saying, David Greenstein used to say, to be or not to be. That is the question. I'm sorry, I can't take credit. So Shmuel HaKatan is quoting a verse from Proverbs. Why are we giving him credit that he said it? And see the comment of Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura, that he would regularly admonish people about this. So Rabbi Ovadia, the Rav, as he's called, was trying to answer this, meaning this seems to have been a verse that he said again and again and again. This was like one of the favorite verses he had to quote. So that's why he's given credit for saying the verse. He didn't make it up, but he used to say it so much. So now, says Reb Tzadok, we said that this is the power of the oral spoken Torah, that the words of Torah can penetrate and be set in one's heart. And Shmuel HaKatan felt a new flavor in this verse. And so did anyone who heard it from him, quoted exactly, and yet with a new flavor to it. So what Reb Tzadok is saying is that we have something called the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the two categories keep on mixing and overlapping and infecting each other. The Mishnah and the Talmud are called the oral Torah, and now we write it down. But everything that is the written Torah, we also say out loud, right? We read the Torah from the Torah scroll and we say it out loud orally. So there's this kind of mix back and forth. So now what Reb Tzadok says is we can have an effect on how the written Torah is absorbed by ourselves and by other people, depending on the voice we use. The personal feelings that somehow get conveyed into the words of our voice, those extra reverberations give color, give meaning, give a certain force, and they will touch a person's heart if they come out of somebody else's heart. And the way we hear it is by the special intonation, the special voice quality of the way they say it. So I can say the same verse as you, but I'll say it differently from you. And certainly if it means something special to you, you're going to say that verse in a way that carries much more feeling than when I just say it because it's a piece of information, another verse to recite. So how much we put our heart into it will then be tangibly conveyed through our voice. This brings us to the last of the whispering stories for today. This is a continuation of Reb Tzadok, but he now tells this story. This is the way our holy teacher, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Ishbitza, explained the story told of Rav Yanai. There was once a peddler, a rochel, who went from place to place calling out, "Who desires life? Who desires life?" Right? So he's a guy running around instead of selling, a knife sharpening or pots and pans or something like that. He says, who desires more life? I've got it. Come to me. Rabbi Yanai heard him and called him over. He says, I would love life. I desire more life. Come on, show me your merchandise. The peddler said, "You're not one who requires my wares." He says, no, you're not the real customer for me. There are other people that need this a lot more than you. You're okay. But Rav Yanai insisted that he show them. So the peddler took a scroll of the Psalms and rolled it to the verse, Mi ha'ish shechafetz chayim, ohev yamim lirotov, litzor l'shoncha meira, u'sfatecha midaber mirma. From Psalm 34, it's a psalm that we traditionally recite every Shabbat morning. Who is a person who deserves life? Guard your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deception. And then Rabbi Yanai, Rabbi Yanai said, all my life I have read this verse, but I have never understood its meaning until this peddler came and proclaimed, who is the one who desires life? That's the end of the story. So this great sage, Rav Yanai, says, whoa, I never understood this verse before until this simple peddler read it out to me. So now Reb Tzadok starts discussing this. But the peddler did not teach anything new. He simply read the verse as is written. So what's so special? Why is Rav Yanai so bowled over? Rather, this peddler had experienced something of this matter and was therefore called a rochel, a talebearer. So what Reb Tzadok says is he's called a rochel. A rochel is both a merchant, a peddler, but also a peddler of rumors, a peddler of gossip. So this person says, Reb Tzadok, he had a little dubious past. He used to be a talebearer. He used to be a person who stirred up, some trouble, some discontent, some resentments. After he had fixed this issue for himself, but then he did tshuva. And he repaired this terrible character flaw of his, and he stopped behaving in that way. He felt a new taste in that verse. So this verse had a personal feel for him. This verse meant something to him that a person who never struggled with that particular issue wouldn't necessarily have right away. You read the verse and you go, yeah, that's a nice piece of wisdom. Great. Let's move on to the next verse. But for him, this changed his whole life, right? Guard your tongue from evil, your lips from speaking deception. That's something that he needed to struggle with every day, not to go there. Why? Because he desired life. He understood that this was a life and death situation for him. Thereby, Rabbi Yanai, when he heard the verse quoted verbatim, could also feel the new taste. So when it came out of the mouth of this man who struggled so hard to make this verse part of his life, then Rabbi Yanai said, you know what, until now, this was just a verse for me. But now it comes out of the heart and into my heart. Now, but not everyone merits this experience. This is Reb Tzadok talking. Therefore, he, Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, and now he's going back to that earlier story about the light. Where did the first light come from? And he said, why are you telling to me in a whisper? And then Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, who answered him in the whisper, he said it to him in a whisper to tell him that he could only get this through a whisper. As explained in the Holy Zohar, to speak in your heart, to speak secretly. This is to say that one must feel it in the depths of one's heart, that which the verse explicitly says, that God is enwrapped in light like a cloak. So the fact that it's there black on white in the verse, it's in every book of Psalms, great, but do you feel it in your heart? That's the whisper. The whisper is the intimacy. The whisper is that secret that finally penetrates. I finally get it. Oh, now I get it. Until now, I was on the outside, and now I'm in. But he, Rabbi Shimon, did not feel it. And so he asked, why are you whispering a simple verse? It's no guarantee. When he whispered the verse, he was full of feeling. He was full of personal engagement in that verse. And nevertheless, the person hearing him didn't let it in. And so he answered, just as I heard it is in a whisper, whoops, meaning he heard it from someone who felt it thus, as a whisper in the heart. And so he passed it on, in the hope that he would merit to feel it as a whisper in one's heart also. It's one concluding text here from another part of Reb Tzadok that drives this home. The oral Torah flows from the dew of the Ancient of Days. As in the verse, may my saying, Imrati, flow like dew. This is at the end. This is Moses' deathbed words, the last words at the end of the Torah. Referring to the oral Torah, while the written Torah is, may my instruction, likhi, beat down like rain. As in, for I have given you instruction that is good. Ki lekach tov natati lachem, torati al ta'azovu. This is because we see clearly that the written Torah, comes from the heavens, just like rain. Rain is obvious, it comes right, we see it falling from the sky. But the oral Torah is whatever the sages of Israel create from their hearts. Yet, they are truly words of the living God. And it is like dew, for one does not see its fall from heaven, but only afterwards one sees the moisture on the earth. This is the meaning, may my saying flow like dew. For saying is by sweet and soft whispering. So what Reb Tzadok is saying is that whispering is so much tied to human efforts to connect up with the Torah. The booming voice of God at Mount Sinai, that, of course, God is God. But then we get this gift of the Torah from God, and who are we? And we struggle with making those divine words part of our own soul, part of our own consciousness, part of our own behavior. And of course, we have to add our own words. Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto, it's not in the Torah. It's the oral Torah. The only way we know these words is because of traditions, because of stories that we tell one another. So those oral Torah contributions, they come, as he says, they create it from their hearts. It's not just an intellectual creativity. It's not just a political and social response to reality. It has to come from the heart. There's a secret to this response, which is what whispering is all about. He drew close and stood beneath the mountain burning with fire to the heart of heaven, the very heart of heaven. And then from the heart of heaven to our hearts, and murky cloud. And the Eternal spoke from out of the fire, the voice of words you were hearing, but not seeing any image, only a voice. And then from the book of Exodus, the voice of the shofar grew ever stronger. Moshe yedaber, v'ha'elokim yahanenu b'kol. Moses would speak, and the Almighty would answer him with a voice. The voice is the divine communication. The whisper is the human communication. Rashbam, a great Bible commentator, and the Talmudic sage also, a commentator for the Talmud, lived in the 12th century, and grandson, I think, of Rashi, says Moses would speak, right? And the Almighty would answer him with a voice. He says, Moses would speak to the Holy Blessed One, and no sound would be heard to any human being, but one to the Holy Blessed One. So that should be only. Whoops. Moses' voice, other people can't hear it. There's so much going on. There's so much cacophony. There's a whole thundering and lightning and booming and the voice of the shofar. The only one who can hear Moses' voice is God. It's like a whisper. When you whisper to somebody and it's only for them. But the Holy Blessed One would respond to Moses with a great voice because of the sound of the shofar that was growing ever stronger. So it was necessary for the voice of the Holy Blessed One to overcome the sound of the shofar in order to be audible to Moses. The great voice is God's voice. The whisper, and no matter how loud we shout, the human voice is just a whisper. It's hardly audible, and it's not a guarantee that anybody actually will hear it, but God will hear it. So our desire to communicate with each other, to caress the words of the Torah, take them deep into our hearts, that's these moments of pathos, these moments of great feeling are commemorated in our tradition through the whisper. I often tell the congregation, let's stand silently. The only one who will hear your prayer is God, but God will hear your prayer, right? Whisper, it means so quiet that nobody else can hear. Just the one beloved with whom you want to share a secret. Any comments, any questions anybody wants to add? Yes, Carol.
It's interesting, the last part that we talked about, keep, from speaking lies and everything like that. When I get to that paragraph in the Emunah, that the beginning of that and that entire paragraph is one of the things that means a lot to me. And I sometimes rush so I can take my time with that paragraph. And now that you have explained it, I can also almost understand better why it means why it means something to me.
It's no coincidence that that paragraph was composed as a personal prayer. That final paragraph, guard my tongue from evil. Oh my God, please help me out here. That prayer was created by one individual, and it was a personal prayer, and it's touching your heart the way it came out of that person's heart. So that makes total sense. Total sense. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yes, Josie.
I'm struck by the fact that most of these sayings are very simple. They're not very complicated on paper, but when you think about the difference between God saying it and a person saying it to another person, it takes on much bigger dimensions.
Exactly. Yep. Well said. John.
I also think of a whisper as like sort of imperfect speech or personal speech or internal speech. It's different. It's very, maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. I whisper to myself a lot when I'm walking around. I say thoughts that I have and that sort of talk to myself a little bit. I don't know why. It just vocalizes them. It makes them concrete in a way that just the thought doesn't.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just trying to think of of that idea about whispers being, vulnerable, fragile.
Absolutely. Right. And the fragility is the fragility of the sound of the words and of the person who's both making the sound and trying to hear the sound. Now, when a person whispers to another person, if you want to hear it, you got to draw close, right? You got to really get very close to the other person. If we have these deathbed scenarios with Jacob and with Moses, so many times, we know that to bend over to that person, to hear that last word, to hear what they want to convey, what they want to say. Maybe they really want to shout, but they can't. The whispering is their fragility, is their mortality, right? And that mortality is what God entrusts the Torah to, right? God takes the Torah out of the eternal realm and says, I'm giving this beautiful, amazing, infinite Torah into the world of fragility, of tenuousness, of limitation, and of mortality. That's us. God gave us this Torah. All right, thank you, everyone. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful, sweet Yom Tov, and all good things. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Yashikoach.
Be well, everybody.